We're going to try to get as much money as we can as long as we don't make the government mad. Business 101. I would never recommend that people commit an illegal act or do what's known as piracy, and the garb that I am not wearing is totally coincidental. All of our products are now going to fall into the category of things that we can take away from you now because you don't have a physical copy. So they basically said it is now illegal for you to play that game. And the last time I checked, I don't know a video game company that has tanks or bazookas outside of the stuff in their games. Sony controversy. Let's talk about this. First thing, anytime you're a professional academic, you're giving an analysis on something, it's important to talk about limitations, methodology, study design, where this is coming from, and depending on what you're doing, you'll go into different parts of this. But for something like this, because this is more of a commentary on ongoing events with some analysis and really a professional perspective, bias is the part of that component that you really want to talk about. So let's declare some bias here. This is a small percentage of the Sony/PlayStation part of the personal collection. We're going to be talking about Sony and PlayStation and some of the messaging that's come out involving it recently. This is going to factor into the bias. When we start speaking about the impact on collectors, for example, there's some personal experience here. In addition to that, because this is going to involve talking about business decisions, perspectives, communications with different sorts of corporate strategy potentially, there is a fair amount of that we've done for work. You know, I own a business, Prepared Canada, hello. Within that, we do our own positioning, our own messaging. We have clients that we assist with in this area, usually in crisis communications, but still it's a communications piece. So there's some experience there that's going to tailor our perspective. In addition to that, there are some clients for Prepared Canada that are technology companies, and we have done a fair amount of work when it comes to risk around IP and trademarks, copyright, and etc. So there is an angle there too, and there are some different biases coming in. So just wanted to say that exists in there, and that's a thing. Okay, so let's explore what's happened with this controversy. For those who don't know, I'm going to give a fairly brief overview of the idea behind this controversy, the two main messages that come through that kind of sparked this whole thing, and then a bunch of background context, because some of you will be aware of a lot of this, some of you will not, but there's a lot of context that sort of goes into this that sort of paints the picture as to why this, or why I would argue this, became such a big controversy flashpoint. And then there's some, where this is going to go, actions that can be taken, the way different people look at this and that whole thing. So, okay, the situation. We have some dates for this. June 25, 2026. Around that date, people on Twitter/X and other social media platforms are putting out messages of a notice that they've been given by Sony, the owner of PlayStation. They are sending them essentially this letter, and I'll read it to you. Dear name, as of the 1st of September 2026, due to our contract licensing arrangements, you will no longer be able to watch any of your previously purchased Studio Canal content, and the content will be removed from your video library. Click here for a full list that will no longer be supported. Thank you, PlayStation Store. The click here has like a little blue thing you click on. And then they have their logo, PlayStation logo, Play Has No Limits. The Play Has No Limits thing in there was picked up on quite a bit, because when people see this Play Has No Limits slogan, and then they're effectively told by the company that they're purchasing their products from that their play does in fact have limits because the content is being removed, that was picked up on pretty immediately. And well, people were not pleased with that. More on that later though, because there's some context with that in later. Okay, so that's the first thing that happens. So that happens, that happens a few days before now. Today is July 6th, so that was a week and a half ago, basically. On July 1st, a few days after that, Sony also released this following message in their PlayStation blog. This message was titled, Physical disc production ending in January 2028 for new games releasing on PlayStation consoles. And the content within that post was, in response to shifting trends in consumer preference, new games will be released on PlayStation Store and at retailers in digital formats only. So they put out the notice here that basically you're not going to be able to get physical copies for things anymore. And the reason given is because basically customers don't want to buy them anymore, is effectively what they're saying. And so it costs us too much to produce these things. People are just buying digital anyways, so we're just going to go all digital. That's essentially what this says. The effect of these two things being combined in that message just on its face, has been received by many consumers, and this is where the controversy comes in, that PlayStation and Sony is willing to, or is showing that it's willing to, pull content from people who've purchased it. The Studio Canal content, there's two different purchasing methods you can do. You can do a similar to a Netflix subscribe method where you purchase time-limited access to a library, and then there's a version where you do a single purchase to buy specific media content. So this is similar to the way you would go to a store like a Blockbuster back in the day, and you would just buy a movie and take it home. This is a digital version of that effectively. So it's single purchase to possess forever is sort of the way that it was explained to the customer. And there's specifics in the legals that we'll get into in a second, but this is the way it's viewed. So this isn't like I didn't pay my Netflix subscription. This is more like I paid $60 for that movie and now you're taking it away from me. What? That happened. And at the same time as that, they're basically saying that all of our products are now going to fall into the category of things that we can take away from you now because you don't have a physical copy. That's the way this is being viewed on the outset. There are different underlying issues here, which we'll get into now. The context surrounding this. So there's a bunch of different things for context. And I want to first talk about the industry trend and how this has changed. In the mid-2000s, video games and entertainment media were starting to become more digital. When you look at games like this, in the mid-2000s, a lot of these games, there was no online capability. Like the PlayStation 2 era, there were only a few games that had the ability to do online, and even then, it was fairly involved to get them to work. One of the first ones to attempt it, I believe, was Final Fantasy XI and SOCOM, I think. But it wasn't very predominant. But over time, with the PlayStation 3 and other consoles that would compete, online became something that was packaged in with it, and certain games became always online. So an example of one of those games would be this game known as MAG. Now, you can't play MAG anymore. MAG doesn't exist anymore. It's here. I have a physical disc. This is MAG. But MAG, or Massive Action Game, was a shooting game where you would play with a team and you'd have basically up to 24 versus 24 versus 24 people. So 72 people all fighting each other on the same map, which in an era of video games when that was simply unheard of, was a huge deal. That game didn't have a single player campaign. It was only online and it was completely dependent on their servers. Over time, the game's player base dwindled, and it no longer was really feasible for them to support the servers, and they shut the servers down. And now you can actually still find and buy this game at some boutique vintage game retailers, but you can't play it. This game, you launch it and you can't do anything. So you start seeing a trend of some games like this starting to exist in sort of the PlayStation 3 era, the mid-2000s, and then on and on and on. Eventually you get to the PlayStation 4 era, PlayStation 5, and now there are a lot of games being sold that just don't even have a disc. The other thing is, before this sort of mid-2000s, most games outside of a few computer games were basically single player, you play it, maybe you play with a friend. You didn't really have as much of the live service model where a lot of people would be playing together in huge amounts. You had some older MMORPGs, massively multiplayer online role-playing games like the EverQuests, eventually like World of Warcraft, which was like mid-2000s, etc. But you didn't have what we have today, the environment of League of Legends, Fortnite, Roblox, and a lot of these games that are online only all the time with different pay models or different monetization models. And with that in mind, I'm going to talk about the reality of monetization now. Because back then, the monetization models were pretty much buy it, own it. We'll get into that in a second, but it's basically single purchase box price, or they were subscription model. And even the subscription games often were single purchase box price with a subsequent subscription. So if you looked at the older multiplayer games like World of Warcraft, etc., you bought the game and then you paid a subscription to keep using the live service. That was only the two models really back then. Now there's, I'd argue, 5 major models for monetization, and sometimes, often games will do both, or like all multiples. So there's buy it, just outright, upon, like, you go to a store, you buy it, single purchase. There is the subscription model. There is the microtransaction model, which if you've played phone games, you're familiar with people that like free to play but pay to something, right? Pay to win, pay to progress, pay for cosmetics, pay for whatever. There's different forms of microtransactions. It's like pay $1 and you can play another round if you lost, right? that sort of idea. There's a whole bunch of different versions of that, but that's a more common model now. There's the advertising model where, similar to the way movies will often work, or a lot of on free TV, your basic cable, it's media that's paid for by advertisements that are placed in the media. So there are some things in this sort of media form that have a revenue stream from advertisements being placed. And then you have data collection. And this is actually a much bigger thing than a lot of people realize. So there are many games that will collect user data and then sell the user data as a major revenue stream. A lot of the free-to-play games will have this. If you've been around this a lot, you may have heard the old saying, or the saying, if the game is free, you're the product. That is referencing data collection. So that's referencing you being the thing that's being sold, or your data being the thing that's being sold. Right now, the most successful games in the market are free-to-play, live service in general, so they require the company to operate them. And they primarily monetize through microtransactions and through data collection. So generally, those are the biggest ones in the market. Examples of this, especially with the microtransaction model, you have Fortnite, you have League of Legends and Riot Games, you have all of the various gacha games, like the Hoyo vs. MiHoYo ones, Genshin Impact. During COVID, if you were playing video games, you're definitely familiar with it, or most people would be. It's a lot of these are games where if you're in the sphere of consuming this media, you would have to live under a rock, as it were, to not have heard of these things before. The point of that being, there's basically a transition from this style model of I pay it, I own it, I'm going to quote unquote own it here, to the live service model, and the public basically is all in on live service. Not all in, but they predominantly reward live service right now. The next thing that I want to talk about with context and background is Stop Killing Games. Now, Stop Killing Games is a consumer movement that was founded in 2024 by Ross William Scott. Now, the reason for this initially, the catalyst, was the shutdown of a video game called The Crew. The Crew is a game that was released by Ubisoft. What basically happened was in 2014, they released this game that had some multiplayer components, but was predominantly a single-player experience. When 2024 hit, they shut down the servers, and because of how the game was designed, it made it impossible to actually access the game. So even though it was a single-player experience and you paid, it's like I went to, let's say you go to a game store and you buy a game, so you bought it, you plugged it in, but it required an online connection to basically load or to get through the menu. Once they basically shut the servers off, this just wasn't usable. Now, in the case of a game like Meg, which is only multiplayer all the time, and there is no single player experience with this, usually gamers will go, yeah, okay, fine, you shut down the servers, you can't support it, I understand. There are caveats to that, but that's generally what they'll do. But with a more single player experience, like many other games in this, there's a kind of a question mark of, but why did you need to do that? While they did that, they simultaneously revoked the licenses of all the users who'd purchased, and anyone who had the game in their online catalog, they simultaneously revoked all their licenses. So they basically said, it is now illegal for you to play that game. So that action resulted in Stop Killing Games being created and a significant consumer movement that galvanized the internet. This was a huge thing in the internet. If you haven't heard about it, it's probably because you're not spending a lot of time on the internet dealing with the gaming sphere. But if you're familiar with the gaming sphere at all, you've heard of this movement before, almost guaranteed. So Stop Killing Games becomes a thing. This is 2024. We'll get into the effect of this more later, but I want to just help you be aware that these events that we're talking about with Sony happened like a week ago, etc. And the Stop Killing Games movement has been kind of front of mind of the internet in this sphere for 2 years now. So this is sort of another example for a movement that's already occurred. One more thing on the Stop Killing Games thing, because I think it's important to mention now. The consumer movement here is not necessarily calling for boycotts outright, although that is a strategy. Their direction with this is to come up with legal avenues to address the concern. If consumers are not being sufficiently protected by the law, and if that is an issue, we should go to the government and change the law. That's sort of the way that they view this, which I'm just going to say, with some analysis right now, sounds fairly plausible. If you think about it from a risk perspective, If you identify a hazard or a challenge, and that challenge is that this thing is occurring, and then you look at the root cause of that or the thing that affects said challenge, which would be consumer protections, who safeguards consumer protections? The government. So you go to government. That just kind of makes logical sense. So this in general makes it's sensible. Okay, intellectual property and licensing. I want to talk about that because I think that you need some context on the way that works and the way this works effectively within this system. Otherwise, this can get pretty confusing. So we'll talk about that. Within intellectual property and licensing, I'm going to break it down into 3 different sections. The first is what licenses are and how they're worded. 2 is the practicality of enforcing said licenses, because just because it's worded away doesn't mean you can enforce it. And 3 is the government's role in this. So first, with licenses and wording, I want to start with physical media because I think it illustrates kind of the problem. Let's say you want to play a video game and you go to the store and we want to play, what's a game that everybody loved back in the day? Here, we wanted to play, and this is a remaster, but what the hey? We want to play Final Fantasy X. Everyone liked Final Fantasy X. You wanted to play Final Fantasy X, or you wanted to play Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne. If you know, you know. So you wanted to play that. Great. You go to the store, you buy the disc. Now, you own the box and the disc. You don't own the software. And this is a nuanced thing that is important to understand with how this is kind of structured and worded and understood legally. You are basically purchasing a physical thing that acts as your end user license to use the software on the thing. So because I own the disc, I'm allowed to use the software. That's basically the way it works. But you don't just have unlimited access to the software. And most people who play video games, and I know this, will understand this. You weren't supposed to anyways, although I know many people would do it. You're not supposed to be copying the software, burning it, as in like creating copies and then selling copies. You're not supposed to be editing the game files. Otherwise, sort of modifying the intellectual property that's contained on the disc. You're sold something in a certain format that you're expected to use in the way that it was designed and sold to you. And that's kind of the intellectual property piece of this. But you don't actually own the software. I'm going to give you the definition of a license now, because I think that that's important to just say it for the sake of saying it. The license is roughly defined as an official document or agreement that grants an individual or technically an entity, so it could be like a company, formal permission to do, own, or use something. And then within that, you have the sub-specifics of what you're allowed to do in your license. So for example, and this will come in with the situation with Sony and the movie library piece, Sony was given a distribution license or some sort of distribution agreement from Studio Canal. So Sony was given a distribution license from them in some form, and then Sony then would have given its consumer or its customer some form of different end user license. But there's different forms of licenses with different restrictions, right? You're allowed to distribute, you're allowed to use. They're different. Anyways, so licensors are a thing. When you look at video game licenses specifically and these end user license agreements, almost all of them, and actually if you look at the back of a PlayStation game and you look at where it says licensing, or if you look at their website and they'll say like all of our licenses are subject to Sony's licensing agreements, and you have to read up what that is. And this is consistent across the whole industry. All of them have some form of this license is revocable at any time for any reason. So they all have some form of, well, I can take it away anytime I want because I'm going to reclaim my intellectual property. None of them are unlimited and none of them are unrevocable. There are some games that do allow this, but you're usually talking about indie games or games from developers that are very, very open and friendly to a modding community. That's not traditional in games like this, but they all have that in some form. Another thing, technically, with these licenses, if you read the back of one of these things too, it'll explicitly state this license is only permitted on the NTSC, and for these it'd be U/C designation only. U/C is United States and Canada. I'm in Canada. So that would effectively mean that I am not allowed to buy a copy of a game from Europe and put it in my console from North America. even if it can physically work, it actually is violating the license. We're not talking about practicality here. We're going to get there in a second. But just keep in mind that as far as this is the way the company views this situation, the way these licenses are worded, they have a very specific niche use that they're expecting, okay? From the company's perspective. And the same thing would be true if you were to think about this from like a technology company's perspective, if they were to license a technology to another company to like produce a product or something for them. From a company's perspective, a license is a license. Whether it's on a physical copy or not, they can take back basically the license at any time, regardless of reason, whether it's a physical copy or not. From their perspective, that's basically how they viewed it. If they want to protect their intellectual property, that's essentially what they would do. If you remove the physical copy, from their perspective, it doesn't change anything. Unless you have something to make a distinction, there is actually no difference between a physical and a digital copy to that company. The to that company is the important part here. Okay, now let's talk about the practicality of this. Because while that's all fine and good, while that's what the company may think or want to have be reality, that's not necessarily practical. So let's talk about in practice. In practice, if you have a physical copy of a game and the company revokes the license, you can still plug in that game. And if they don't have a way to stop you from doing that, they would have to physically come and take it out of your hands. They're basically not going to do that. The onus in that situation is on the company to sue the consumer, because the consumer can say, prove I'm still using your game. This dynamic shifts when you have an online platform that's supported by the company. Practically, when you have the necessity of the online platform being there, instead of the consumer basically being able to call the company's bluff and say, sue me, it changes to the company being able to call the consumer's bluff and say, sue me. Because the company can actually take away your ability to do the thing, and now the onus is on the consumer to get a lawyer and charge the company for taking their property and making them give it back to them or whatever. There's a practical difference here in who is forced to basically go get the lawyer first and pay the legal expenses and etc. The reality is that with an individual consumer with like a $60 game and with the hourly cost of a lawyer, no company is realistically going to go after a consumer for still plugging their console in and playing a video game. It's just not practical. It would cost more for an hour of the lawyer's time than the total value of the unit. Many lawyers that these companies hire are going to bill at or over $1,000 an hour. What's the point? Like, let alone like the litigation, etc. Like, what is the point? Send a cease and desist. Great, please enforce it. They're not going to. And if they do, it wouldn't be in their shareholders' interest generally. So that dynamic, of course, those shifts. Because on the other side, are you going to go sue the billion-dollar corporation? Is the consumer going to sue the billion-dollar corporation because they want to play a $60 video game? No, they're generally not. If enough of them get together in a class action or something, maybe the government might force it through, consumer protection, fine. But on an individual like civil claim, it's ridiculous. Most people don't have the power to do said thing. That dynamic shift is important here. And that's a huge practical difference between the first and the second. Other than that, it's the same old, like a license is a license. But then comes in the role of government. Now, I want everyone to really think about this for a second. All of these modern license agreements, and I pulled Sony's version 2.0 license agreement, which as far as I can tell is what applies to all of their existing licenses right now. All of these license agreements will either say or implicitly be forced into this following line, and this is going to be directly from their agreement. Usually this is put in all capital letters or bold or something to make it obviously clear to the reader as much as possible, usually because, frankly, one of these companies' lawyers want to really make sure that this is made obviously clear to people. There's something in this whole process in most countries called acting in good faith. There is an expectation that parties involved in this try to do what's known as acting in good faith. Acting in good faith can mean a bunch of different things, but basically it means being reasonable, doing the right thing, erring on the side of doing whatever would be reasonably necessary to not kind of pull one over on somebody or act in a bad way. So an example of this would be if you have MAG here, and MAG is an always online game, Acting in good faith would be saying, well, look, if we don't have enough people playing it, we're going to shut the servers down because we got to run a business here, guys, because it's multiplayer online only. And on the box, it says multiplayer online only, multiplayer online only. You can only play multiplayer, only on network, get a network. In the actual guidelines here, there's like they say it like 15 times. Okay. So that's acting in good faith. That's saying like, look, one day we might shut the servers down. Okay. Fair enough. If it's obscured or it's not obvious to players, then that could be interpreted as not acting in good faith. What companies will do is these certain things like what I'm about to mention, they'll make it really obvious. So this says, in addition, as a consumer, you may have rights under applicable local laws that cannot be excluded, limited, or changed. These rights take priority over anything in this agreement. Now, local laws will cover anything in your jurisdiction, be it municipal, provincial, federal, or state or federal, whatever. A local law is a law that applies to you, period. So if you have a state law or a provincial law or a country law, federal law that applies to you, that supersedes the whole agreement. So whatever you signed or whatever you implicitly agreed to upon playing something with whatever company, if it's not in accordance with what your country says, it's wrong. And they say it right up front. They all do this, and they do this because they need to legally act within your country. So really, they can write something that's just wrong, but they make products in so many different countries, and a lot of companies will do this. You make so many products in so many different countries that if you miss something, you just put something and say, look, okay, if we're wrong, we're just going with whatever the government says. This is important. This is very, very important because they're basically saying what all businesses do. We're going to try to get as much money as we can as long as we don't make the government mad. Business 101. Governments have what's known as a monopoly on violence. What do I mean by this? At the end of the day, the government decides what is and is not going to happen. Now, there's different ways the government can be influenced. You can have a transfer of power. There's, voting and lobbying. But at the end of the day, whatever the government says you have to do, at some point, they can force you to do. If a company doesn't want to listen to the government, eventually, if the government is particularly perturbed, the police get involved. And if the company doesn't want to listen to the police, eventually, if the government is particularly perturbed, the military gets involved. And if the company doesn't want to listen to the military, they better have their own private military. And the last time I checked, I don't know a video game company that has tanks or bazookas outside of the stuff in their games. At the end of the day, these companies are forced at some point to listen to the government. And all these companies know this. They would never be that adversarial with the government and get to that point. You have the rules of the market that you play within, and the government tells you what those rules are. If you don't want to play within that market, you leave the market. And there are many companies that don't go into certain countries because they just don't want to deal with those countries' rules. Fair enough. This is relevant. I'm going to keep coming back to this because this is a central point, and you'll see this coming up again and again and again. At some point, if the issue is consumer protection, the avenue to address said issue is the laws around consumer protection. Now, when it comes to regulations and following what the law says you're supposed to do, there are basically three options. I have to now grab all the paper. Okay, a company basically has three options. Option one, you follow the regulations and do what the government says. Option two, you pay the fine. And actually, option two is actually still following the regulation. It's referred to as the cost of doing business. So there is a world where you basically just don't follow what they say to do, but instead of doing that, you pay the fine. And you're basically paying the cost of not doing the thing the government told you to do. And this is effectively just a business expense. So I know people aren't going to like that, but that's effectively one of the things that you can do. You can just pay the fine and never change what you're doing. Now, the reality is that if the cost of following the regulation is greater than just paying the fine, most businesses should be just paying the fine instead and not changing their behavior. It's what makes the most money. Businesses are often motivated by maximizing return. So that's what you should do. If that is the action that is occurring. Maybe the law should be changed, or the regulation should be changed where the fine is increased, or there is a non-monetary consequence that's given to a company because of it. You change their property rights, you find executives personally liable, whatever. If it makes business sense to pay the fine and you don't want the people doing it and you aren't okay with the fine just being the consequence, then you should change what the consequence is within the law, right? And then number three, the company can just choose not to operate in the country. They can just choose to leave the country. So sometimes government comes in that puts certain very, very restrictive regulations in, and the company says, you know what, we just don't want to deal, and they leave. There are options that companies can have. I'm going to explore the last one a bit more though. So the one where the company just leaves the country. There are many situations where people want to access certain media and the company doesn't exist in the country. There's no legal way to actually obtain the media. So if there's no way to get the media, you can't legally obtain it. International treaties towards copyright protections would still apply, but the government probably isn't going after the individual consumer too much for a company that isn't even there. Think about it this way. You're the government of country Y, and some company that doesn't pay taxes in your country, doesn't create jobs, doesn't do anything in it, says, hey, one of your citizens is stealing my movie. Stop them. Why would you care? Like, really, why would you care? Why would you incur the risk of agitating your citizenry to the benefit of a private entity that isn't giving you anything? There's an argument if they're part of your country, that's different. But a lot of countries, and you'll see this, that have rampant piracy, they just don't care. Like, why would they? They just side with their citizens and move on with their day. Now, there is the potential for a country to do that anyways, but usually if a country does that, they become highly unpopular and they have issues with re-election or whatever. So there is that piece. But in general, like, why would you care? The other thing is, and this comes into play with not having access, when a copyright holder restricts access to things to an extreme degree, it becomes an issue of archiving and preservation. So there are different like museums and archiving organizations and preservation of art and what humans have accomplished organizations that want to be able to have things so that it's not lost forever to time. They will often have a significant interest in getting around these copyright things and trying to keep these things in existence. And the Stop Gilding Kings movement actually is sort of adjacent to this, which is interesting because some of the arguments they make are, well, this thing just doesn't exist now. You can't play it. They're not trying to make money off of it. So what's the harm in having people have access to something where the company doesn't intend to make any money off of it anyways? That sort of argument's made. That's all context. Let's get into analysis here. So looking at the Sony controversy, people tended to fall into about 4 different categories. There's some overlap, but generally they were fairly distinctive. One, you had the physical copy collector. So someone who collects video games with physical copies. They were generally just sad or disappointed or generally just not happy with the reality that the field of their collection, the thing that they do, might just not be around anymore. Because if no one makes physical copies of these anymore and they like collecting physical copies, then we're talking about like, you know, ancient technology here. If you were someone who collected VHS tapes and no one's making them, well, you can't collect more now because there's no new ones coming out, and that's just kind of sad. The second perspective that comes up pretty often and has been significantly referenced through this is the consumer protection stuff. People that are concerned with consumer protection laws and regulations and etc. A lot of this was people who play video games, but this category actually transcended that. People that are concerned with consumer protections, period, that were just using this video game issue as a proxy for their overall concerns, which fair enough, that was a significant amount of response. So there are people that we got engaged on this, even though they didn't necessarily play video games. That was group 2. Group 3, a big group that we saw a lot of, was video game customers that just didn't care. So there's a large number of people who play the free-to-play games that have microtransactions. They've been downloading games forever. A lot of people are familiar, in the gaming sphere will be familiar with Steam. So there's people who, they don't even play on consoles anymore. They basically gave up a long time ago, went entirely to using their personal computer and going on to just downloading games. They just don't care. They're either in the category of they've basically given up, and they used to be sort of a category 1 or a category 2, but they just went, know what, I'm just going to move on and not care about this anymore. Or they're people that never really cared about the consumer protection stuff anyways. And by the time one of their games goes offline, they're going to be on a new one anyways, and they'll forget about the old one, and they're not really going to miss much. That seemed to be actually the majority of people, even though they weren't particularly vocal, which will tie into some of the issues with various parts of this on either side later. A lot of people just don't care. And then 4, you have just everybody else. So the giant group of people that don't play games, don't otherwise care about this issue, they don't really care about consumer protection laws. You know, they might say to a friend that sounds like something that's bad, but they're not going to be engaged in it or, you know, change their voting patterns, but they just don't really care. They're focused on other stuff in their life. And that's also a significant percent of the population. They just don't care. So with that in mind, let's look at Sony's perspective. When you look at this through a communications lens, there are 2 possibilities that immediately occur. So there's 2 things that are, in my mind, initially likely that occurred with this. A, this could be that Sony as a large organization could have had 2 separate groups. One that was dealing with this licensing concern with the studio, and one that was dealing with the rollout of a transition to more digital media that weren't communicating to each other, and that this was just very poorly timed, and they put both things out and it looks really bad. So this could just be a communications error due to organization being large, because the reality is that they were forced to pull that media library, and they are, you know, going to be to some degree fiscally pushed at minimum towards this digital only strategy. And the communications department assuredly doesn't make this decision. They're just told what the decision is and they say, you know, break it to the people. From a communications perspective, this sort of potential error could likely be because there's 2 different communications teams and they just don't talk, and they released it too closely together. That could be the first thing that happened. The second thing that could be what happened, which is very interesting in my opinion, is they could have actually coordinated the release of both of these at the same time. There is a unique and interesting strategy in communications where when you have a bunch of bad news to give to people, you just launch it all around the same time. You just kind of, you know, give them everything. And then whatever the most bad thing is kind of sticks in their mind, and all the other stuff kind of gets washed out by the most bad thing. It's actually a common political strategy that's used now too when you have to do unpopular policy. You just do like 5 unpopular things at the same time, and the most unpopular one that you know people are going to get mad at that you're forced to do anyways, you just make sure that that's the news story. And then the 4 less popular things or whatever it is, people just forget because they're so focused on the big thing, and then by the time the news moves on, they missed those things because they were so all encompassed with the other thing. There is the potential that this is actually part of that. I'd be curious to see which one of those 2 things is talked more about. I think they're kind of linked, but I'd be curious to see if people are talking more about one, the other, or both in about a month's time, and if that was sort of a coordinated communication strategy, because that would be interesting if it was so. Now let's look at what they did with each event and sort of why, and sort of the business look on this. So with the Studio Canal event, with the content involving that, we don't have the agreement in front of us. We don't have the agreement in front of us, right? But it is likely that the copyright holder, so that studio, pulled the distribution license or pulled their ability to distribute, and then Sony was basically left with, well, we're not allowed to distribute this. Now, having said that, there is a question of, should a company have a continuity plan for provision of service in the event of a license being pulled? I would argue, you know, as things evolve, one thing that people might want to ask for as a consumer or demand for purchase is something from a company showing how they're going to guarantee continuity of service in the event of whatever. You know, it's not my problem that your license gets pulled. That is a reality of business. What are you going to do so that I'm not affected? This is something that is standard practice in many supply chains. You are making cars, for example, and you want to go get a specific part for your car manufacturing line. You go to 3 companies that are going to make X, Y, Z, and you say, hey, what are you going to do to show that you don't have a disruption so that I keep getting my part? Right? The consumers can simply say, what are you going to do so that I still get my movie? This isn't a me problem. This is a you problem. There is that piece there. And I think that that is something that people could be asking more for. And I think that frankly, Stop Killing Games, predominantly, what they're doing is effectively that. It's asking for continuity of service. They might say continuity of service 1 or 2 times, but it's effectively a continuity of service play, right? So what are you going to do that? But either way, the reality is their license was pulled and their hand was forced. In doing that, there is a question. Why not say to the customer, okay, September 1st, 2026 is the deadline. You don't have access to this. We can't give it to you after this point because we're just not legally allowed. Fine. Why not just let them download it before that date? Send out an email to all your customers. Look, we're losing this library. Anything in this library, just download because we can't give it to you after. It is possible that there are two predominant reasons why that would not happen. One, there's an explicit clause in their agreement with the studio that they're not allowed to do it. That would stop it right there. And two, the way their DRM, their digital rights management system, is structured could actually prevent it. Now, on the DRM side, this isn't a technical limitation usually, because with the way DRM is done, there's usually some form of encryption or some form of basically lock, effectively, that's put on the content. And by connecting home to the company, you're basically given a key to get through the lock. You can give people access to a key locally on their computer. So if you were going to not store this anymore, it is trivial for any DRM program, basically. And this is my understanding after talking to multiple people who work in this area that know this well. So if you disagree with me, fair enough, but that means all the experts that definitely do this that I talk to would be wrong. So fair enough, but let me know if all the experts I talk to on this or specific niche are wrong. From what I understand, it is fairly trivial to basically give a perpetual decryption license with an encrypted file that's just offline on their computer locally. So unless there is a clause in the agreement that prevents them from doing so, then that would be an easy fix. I'm not sure why not do that from a communication standpoint. They might be forced to doing that soon, which would be interesting. But anyways, so there's that piece. Let me explore DRM a bit, because DRM ends up being kind of the boogeyman for a lot of this in this conversation. DRM, or digital rights management, is the mechanism in which this license is pulled from the consumer through a digital form, or how it is enforced through a physical form. So DRM is the mechanism in which this stuff occurs. It's central to all of this. It's an umbrella term that refers to anything basically that is used to restrict access to the content. It's not just like I install my DRM program and it's like the program called DRM. It's like all the programs that do that are all referred to as the category of DRM. So it's the overarching umbrella. Publishers and content holders, people who hold copyright, generally like DRM because it gives them a mechanism in which to defend and protect their copyright. This makes sense. From the perspective of, a technology company, you do all this stuff, you develop this thing, you don't want your stuff stolen. On one hand, you want your product to be used, but on the other hand, you have your intellectual property, which you've sunk huge percentages of your business into. And if people just take it and iterate off it too quickly, then you put all the money in and then they got all the profit. And it makes multiple sectors basically unsustainable if you don't have the ability to protect copyright. Research and technology and development becomes impractical in a lot of systems without something to protect copyright. On the other hand, there's the consumer reaction to DRM. Now, when consumers interact with DRM, you get a variety of reactions. You get one, when it comes to technology specifically in this, it often requires resources to actually run, so it makes the thing you're running less efficient. There are some games where they actually functioned with a weaker performing system, but then when DRM was added to them, the system couldn't run it anymore because the DRM took so much power and it took so much processing ability that it made the game no longer functional. So there's an actual effect on performance because this thing it hogs so much extra room in processing power, etc., right? There's an effect on the product to the end user in some cases that they don't like. That's the first. The second, sometimes there is a serious convenience issue. Repeatedly logging in, repeatedly, finding the encryption key. You don't have a stable internet connection. You can't play your game. You're in the middle of a play session and then your internet goes out for whatever reason. It's disrupted, can't play. Things like that. Depending on whether or not you have stable internet, this can be incredibly frustrating for some players, so they don't like it for that reason. This relates to functionality. One of these is whether or not the thing works at all, and the other is just it's inconvenient and annoying. Next, you have use restrictions. So with use restrictions, It is difficult to just hand your thing to a friend and have them borrow it or sell it to somebody when you have copyright protections in, because it's often tied to a personal account. Interestingly enough, Sony put out a clip taking public sentiment to their benefit many years ago when their competitor Microsoft said that they were going to put DRM basically in all of their games for Xbox. And the Sony reply to this was to do a fairly flippant, this is how you share a game with a friend on Sony, and you hand it to somebody and say, that's what you do, to just kind of poke fun at the DRM use that's done with Microsoft.
This is how you share your games on PS4. Thanks.
PlayStation.
Now, in this case, this is being viewed as the company that did that, sort of betraying its user base, right? DRM brings up those sorts of emotions in people because video games are often thought of similar to like trading cards. You want to pick it up, hand it to a friend, and hey, your friend, just go play it. And when they're tied to accounts with these sorts of things, you can't really do it the same way. Steam somewhat gets around this to some degree, and a few other online platforms kind of get around it slightly, but it's not the same as physical copies. When you have something where the company has clearly said, we can take this away at any time, it feels like you've purchased something, but you don't own it. And when you're buying something to own it, but then you feel like you don't own it, it's just kind of unsettling. And many consumers have said that this is what DRM makes them feel like, and it gives them sort of a negative experience. Taking all this from the digital entertainment company's perspective, most of their market and most of their potential market is likely to be a bunch of people that don't really care enough to change their buying patterns. Physical media isn't being purchased in large amounts. If you go into a local game store in Canada and an electronics boutique, which is a GameStop over here, but in America, GameStop, or you go into any major game retailer that's selling, current games, not like vintage, they're selling a lot of collectible items, they're selling codes, they're selling extra paraphernalia and stuff. They're not doing as much hard disk. And people, very often will say, I don't want to have all this stuff around my house. I want to live more minimalist. I'm happy to just have an account. If I lose my disc, I don't lose my game. A lot of people are looking for some of the convenience elements that are present in just going all digital. So the market is shifting there, and Sony does reference this. Once a piece of media, especially with gaming, is no longer financially sustainable to maintain. So once there's so few players that it doesn't make sense to keep running it, most companies will basically say that the customer base that remains here is so low and is so unlikely to give me extra revenue that I'm okay just no longer paying for it and incurring whatever negative consequence occurs, because that's not where my money is coming from anyways. They don't really care if they make them angry because it's not a big enough percentage of their customer base, and these other people are going to buy their game. Think about it this way. There are many companies in a lot of these hobby-related things that make most of their money when the person gets into it initially. They don't make a lot of their money from returning business, or there's a limit. A great example of this would be people getting into Tabletop Warhammer. Tabletop Warhammer and games like this will often have you get excited, you buy a bunch of stuff, you get into this new thing, and then you get this thing, then this thing, then this thing, you make all this money, and then you look back at it and you go, you know what, I'm going to be a bit more discerning with what I purchased this time. And then the buying patterns change from the initial splurge to kind of a slower trickle. From a business's perspective, it makes more sense to focus on new client acquisition in some of these cases, or trying to get you to buy a new product than trying to sell older product or get people who've already purchased all this stuff. If you already have 100 video games, do you need another 100? Versus if this person has 2, they might be more likely to purchase more. They're targeting different customers. In many ways, if you just bought the new hot game, you're not a new potential customer for that new hot game. You've already purchased it. Once you've purchased it, for many companies, you don't matter now because they don't have repeated purchases. With the live service models where they have microtransactions, that's different. But with this sort of model, once you've bought it, they don't need you anymore. That perspective taints how they're viewing this. Companies fundamentally are going to target the customer that gives them the greater return on investment. And right now, that's basically phone games. So it's not really a surprise that they're going this way because of the way the consumer is voting with their wallet. From the consumer's perspective here. So this is going to be largely consumers that are concerned with this trend to DRM and, find that this is a problem. So I'm not going to talk about the consumers that generally like this because why would they care? They're happy. Getting stuck on the nuances of DRM is not likely to be the most productive. It will be relevant insofar that legislation is concerned to some degree, but I don't think that trying to stop DRM directly outside of legislation, for example, is necessarily going to do much. Here are the sort of things that I think would be more productive or more likely to have an effect. One, just don't buy it. So vote with your wallet. The reality is that if it is required for your purchase, that if you're going to buy something past a certain dollar amount, that you own it, and they're saying you do not own this, and based on the way that you define ownership, you don't own it, and that is required for you, then you shouldn't buy it because you're not getting what you paid for by definition. If this is your expectation, state it. And if they're not willing to meet it, don't buy it. If you want to make banana bread, do you go into a grocery store and buy apples? Right? You don't want to buy it, don't buy it. And hopefully with time, that sends the signal to customers. Now, look, the reality is that if enough people do that and they don't just send their money to the other games, eventually an entrepreneurial business is going to say, I think I want to make games for people that want to own them, that have more customizability and da-da-da-da-da. For those of you who are familiar with Steam games and, heavily modded games, you might look at Bethesda, for example, look at Skyrim, look at survival games. I'm going to throw out other things like Kenshi for those of us that are particularly discerning around modded post-apocalyptic hellscapes. There are games that exist for this demographic. If you want to just, you want developers that say, go ahead. Minecraft, depending on the era that you got it in, right? So there are games that fulfill this niche. If they're not serving you, don't give them your money. Number two, and for this, I think that we require some more context. One moment. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I would never recommend that people commit an illegal act or do what's known as piracy, and the garb that I am not wearing is totally coincidental. Some individuals may decide, this is the second thing, to pirate. So they may decide to get an interesting hat and an eye patch and a peg leg and follow popular internet sentiment of if buying isn't owning, then piracy isn't stealing. Now, with that in mind, that is not legally correct. And is piracy illegal? Probably. There is some gray area depending on whether or not the country is willing to enforce and the aforementioned issues of if the media isn't available in your country, the country is willing to enforce. So it's complicated. But generally, no. Realistically, though, from a risk perspective, and we mentioned this before, the company is not going to spend more on lawyers than they could reasonably collect from the person pirating. And for those who have been around on the internet for a very long time and remember LimeWire, where you can get pretty much any media and more viruses than you can track it with the public health department. So if you remember LimeWire, or BitTorrent, or Yarhar Pirate Bay, or whatever. This is something that has been around forever. This is something that people are commonly used to doing. I'll talk more about that in a second. But so number two is, the piracy option, which some people will definitely do. Once again, I would not recommend doing it, and this is entirely coincidental. The third thing that can be done is change the law. Now, change the law is working within whatever government system that person has and working on the consumer protection regulations and the law itself. With that in mind, more on the Yarhar. I'm just gonna, it's hard to read with the eye patch. So I'm just gonna do that, okay? So more on Yarhar, yeah? Yarhar is gonna be the strategy that is adopted by people who basically aren't able to vote with their wallet predominantly. So if someone doesn't have the money to vote with their wallet, they're gonna be probably engaging in Yarhar anyways, and they're probably gonna get away with it, depending on the country. Some interesting notes on piracy and the way it's been viewed even by software companies for a while. Bill Gates, famously known for founding Microsoft and the Windows operating system. was quoted in the 1990s on discussing Windows Pirate Softy, and they changed their policy in the mid-2000s on this, but he was quoted as saying, I'm going to read this, "And as long as they're going to steal it, we want them to steal ours. They'll get sort of addicted, and then we'll somehow figure out how to collect sometime in the next decade." This speaks to the corporate strategy of market dominance. The reality is that if someone isn't going to be your customer anyways, and if they pirate, then you haven't lost money and you've gained greater presence in the marketplace. Some companies view it this way. Now, there's a give and take here, because when you are open and okay with people pirating your game or your content and aren't litigious, then some of your potential customers will probably pirate and there's revenue loss there. But there's a strategy. There's other companies like Studio Project Red, famous for The Witcher 3, Cyberpunk. They also had a similar approach to Bill Gates in the 1990s and before the mid-2000s, where basically they would release patches that even worked on pirated versions of their game, and they would release free content after the game had been purchased with DLCs, and they would say to people basically, we don't care if they pirate our game, but we want our thing to be good enough where they choose to buy it anyways. And the response from the internet generally was, yeah, a bunch of people pirated their game. But in addition to that, they also very often, like you'd see these people that would publicly say, you know what, we pirated this, but then we went out and bought 3 copies after because it was that good. Did that make up for it? Maybe yes, maybe no. But it was an interesting strategy. So this is all to say that the issue of piracy is complicated. It is, I would say, probably legally not a great idea for the individual because it is not, it's illegal. But when you look at games, they're a legally gray ecosystem. They really, really are. So for the sake of interest here, this is bias coming out, but I think this is going to be providing context. I and a lot of people I know play a fair amount of rhythm games like Dance Dance Revolution and etc. If you know anything about the rhythm game community, or if you're in it, then you would know that if DRM were to be truly pervasive and implemented everywhere and everything, rhythm gaming basically wouldn't exist the way it is right now, because most rhythm games on virtually anything you play on any platform are basically level editors that are dependent on writing a level over top of music that no one basically pays a license for. And it's not legally gray. Like they're not supposed to do it. And almost all of them exclusively do it. It's one of the reasons why if you try to find a lot of like rhythm gaming content on YouTube, it just gets copyright striked all the time. So, certain games are in this weird area. When you look at the custom things done for games that are openly allowing it, like Skyrim, Skyrim's the big one. Bethesda lets you do all sorts of stuff. A lot of them will use assets from other games on the mods that they haven't paid for, where if you were to really investigate it closely, they would be breaking copyright somewhere, or they'd be breaking some sort of license agreement or access to some intellectual property because they don't have rights to it, but they just put it in the game. If you want to, you can turn every dragon in Skyrim into Thomas the Tank Engine.
Sentries, what do you see? It's in the clouds!
Okay, like the amount of times that I have just seen SpongeBob SquarePants inserted into the middle of a game, they did not pay for that license. People just put things in stuff. So this is normalized in this community, okay? It's complicated with gaming. There's a lot of kind of free creative space where people are not paying for stuff, okay? So it's complicated. Anyways, that's enough of that. Let's get on to changing the law. So when you're looking at changing the law, you need to educate the lawmakers on the issue. A lot of lawmakers will not be people who've played a lot of video games. They're not going to know the nuances. They're not going to know what's kind of culturally normative in it. They're not going to know the landscape as well. And in order to even interact with them, a lot of the time you'll have to be a registered lobbyist, or you'll have to have a registered lobbyist represent you because you're lobbying to change policy or change the law in a lot of these Western systems. And there are rules around that. And there's laws around how you do that. There's ways to do and not to do that. And on the other side, the industries that could be negatively impacted impacted, their bottom line, their business could be negatively impacted by this, are going to be lobbying against this sort of thing. So you need to, if you want to really change this, you need to learn how these things work, kind of get into the weeds, probably get a whole bunch of people together and spend a fair amount of money on a lobbying firm. This has to become a significant sort of endeavor. So with that in mind, if we were to think about this from the perspective of the consumer and try to do it to their benefit here, a law that would come forward that would be productive for them would likely not want to be around nuanced or convoluted policies around DRM. If the law gets focused around what sort of DRM you are and are not allowed to do, the likely result is loopholes being created where business will adapt and just basically do the same thing anyways. I can say from experience that business is very good at quickly finding a new loophole and making one small change and basically doing the same thing. Yeah, business is real good at doing that. So you don't want it to be buried in the convoluted part of DRM. Instead, what I think would be more productive is if you focused on right to own and making licenses in general perpetual and automatically irrevocable. So basically you have something that just supersedes the company's end user license agreements and says, no, they have this forever. You know, they make the purchase, they can play it forever, and you have to do something to facilitate that. Probably also incorporate some sort of obligation to continuity of service where there's some sort of recourse. Now, if you wanted to look into the way to do that, actually the Stop Killing Games movement has outlined quite a few different recourses for this, and it's fairly well thought out. I've seen quite a few different sort of social movements, political movements, consumer movements, etc. throughout the years, and a lot of them get a bit outlandish. This one is actually pretty tame. Like it seems reasonable. It seems like they're trying to find some, fair middle ground where the companies are still making money. From what I've seen with this one, it seems just kind of like they ought to be taken seriously and given, the time of day. Interestingly, their way of attacking this challenge has been through going to legislation, going to Senates, going to the European Commission, and more recently, actually, with a news update happening in the last couple days surrounding similar timeline to this other stuff coming out, trying to get legislation passed through California in the United States with the Protect Our Games Act. This looks fairly promising. So if you're somebody that is particularly animated on this issue and you're looking at, hey, I wish X, Y, and Z were done, this thing exists. There is someone going at this issue right now. The laws that are written such are fairly reasonable, and they're in a specific small jurisdiction. But the reality is that if California in America changes its laws and puts in some pretty aggressive consumer protection things, because of the size of the market, may actually force companies to modify the way they are providing service across America as a whole, just to make it consistent and easier. And once California adopts it, as long as another government doesn't get in the way, the rest of America might adopt it. And if the United States of America adopts heavy consumer protection legislation, which it being a country that historically has been, from what I can best estimate, one that tends to side with the corporate interest. EU and Canada, I would argue, have much stronger consumer protections. But if the United States goes that way, that could be a paradigm shift. Sometimes it just needs the first domino, and then you have the sort of cascading effect there where they go, you know what, we'll do it too, and you have a bit of a movement on the thing. Anyways, a lot of that long thing on the Sony thing. I know that some of you were definitely asking for this. We have a large collection of things here. Maybe I'll move the camera closer so that John can get a better shot of that for all those interested. But I now have at least 10 mosquito bites, and this is going to drive me absolutely up the wall. So I'm going to take my little totally not fun hat here and yar har, have a good day, me hearties.